So on this Graduate Sunday, it is my delight and joy, well, it's our delight and joy to have Emily as our preacher today. Emily is a graduate student here at OSU in marine biology. She's a former graduate of Yale University, and she's in the process of moving from science to religion, or maybe combining the two, because she is in discernment for ordination to the priesthood. So Emily, it is wonderful to have you open God's word for us today.
Creator of all, open our ears to hear your word. Open our hearts to witness your creation. Where in your life do you hear the voice of God? Sometimes this answer feels easy to me. I hear God everywhere, in the rush of the ocean, in birdsong at sunrise, in gentle wind. I feel like my life is a constant Mary Oliver poem, who writes, "Every day I see or hear something that more or less kills me with delight." I feel like singing the lines from Haydn's Creation, "The heavens are telling the glory of God." I feel like the first two readings from today, in which the words glory, rejoicing, praise, and exalt appear approximately 20 times. Then there are other days. Winter landscapes, when the sounds of nature muffle and fade. Internal winters, too, when despair or loss or loneliness or pain make us feel cut off from any wider presence or voice. The reality is this. There are seasons of life when we feel like the voice of God is abundantly on, with the volume turned to high. And there are other seasons, often the times when we need God most, when we can't seem to tune in at all. This dilemma is at the core of today's gospel reading. On the one hand, we're in the season of Pentecost, a time of outpouring voices and tongues. But even now, absence and silence linger beneath the readings, because Christ is leaving. In the recent chapters of John, we've seen foreshadowing of his ascension as he visits friends and leaves words of wisdom behind. We see the disciples begin to grapple with the fact that in a few short weeks, Jesus will no longer be standing beside them, gesturing with hands and speaking with words. What then? Where shall we hear the voice of God? When the Spirit of truth comes, she will guide you into all the truth, says Jesus. For she will speak not on her own, but will speak whatever she hears. She will glorify me, because she will take what is mine and declare it to you. All that the Father has is mine. It takes a moment to decode what Jesus, via John, is actually saying here, because the grammar is complicated. Christ speaks of a time in which his own incarnate form will be replaced by the Holy Spirit. On the one hand, the Spirit proceeds from God the Father. On the other hand, the Spirit will speak in a language that belongs to Jesus in his earthly form. He will take what is mine and declare it to you. What are we to make of these mixed languages? And more importantly, does this gospel tell us something about where in our own lives we can listen for the voice of God? To get at these questions, I want to tell you a story. Most of you know me in my church roles, as acolyte or Eucharistic minister, or the one who swings that smoking, smelly thing as a thurifer. But in my day job, I'm a scientist, a graduate student at OSU studying marine ecology. For me, there's never been a conflict between the practice of science and the practice of religion. Both are ways to gesture to a mystery and a connectedness at the core of creation. I feel this connection most strongly when I work with DNA. For my college thesis, I sequenced the genomes of hundreds of fish. I began with tiny glass jars of tissue, slowly degrading ethanol-soaked fins that told us nothing about who these fish are or how they're related. Over 2 years, then, I altered the fish beyond recognition. Tissue turned to microliters of dissolved DNA, which was replicated with PCR, mixed and centrifuged with lime green reagents. Tiny dots of liquid were loaded onto plates, shipped to sequencing facilities, and turned into files of data millions of letters long. Finally, after months of writing computer code to decrypt these sequences, I crossed my fingers, said a little prayer, and pressed Run Algorithm. On my screen appeared a phylogenetic tree. A phylogenetic tree is a diagram. You can think about it kind of like a map of evolution, with branches and lines that show us how similar creatures are. This tree showed that I'd discovered 5 new species of fish. But when I first beheld it, I wasn't thinking about genes or species. I wasn't thinking at all. Instead, I was feeling a surge of overwhelming wonder and awe and gratitude. To think that a process that began with microscopic fin clips could end in an image showing the relationships of living things, order and pattern and story, where before there was nothing more than a vial of dead fish. Franciscan writer Richard Rohr tells us, God always and forever comes as one who is totally hidden and yet perfectly revealed in the same moment. God speaks through what is. This is the first lesson I want us to draw from the gospel today. God speaks through what is, and what is the material of bodies, of physical creatures, of cells, and of genes. We see this idea in today's Old Testament reading, too. Divine wisdom comes to us through concrete images of skies, springs, hills, and seas. The text is a beautiful pairing to help us make sense of John's gospel. There is no line between the language of Christ, a language of body, of earth, and flesh, and the language of God. As Christ says, all that the Father has is mine. And if we think about it, why wouldn't God choose DNA as a medium to express his language? In many ways, it's ideal material. The language of DNA is universal. The same 4 nucleotides encoding the same 20 amino acids are present in every species and give rise to all of life's diversity. DNA is endlessly creative. It can change based on context, constantly molded by natural selection to better mirror its surroundings. And DNA is both eternal and utterly new. Picture the chromosomes inside your own body. Your genome holds the story of millennia of evolution, a story about not just our own primate lineage, but a record that extends back to the earliest forms of replicating life. Yet each time your cells copy and divide, this oldest history is expressed in brand new substance. The phosphates and sugars and bases that build your DNA come from the food you ate this morning, harvested from this soil and this sunlight and this water, in the here and now. So the genome is at once timeless and particular, bounded and infinite, continuous and discrete. Can you think of better words to capture the mystery of an incarnate yet infinite God? Now, it's worth pausing here to make a distinction, because there are several ways that we could interpret the connection I just made between God and DNA. Is God literally present in physical creation, each particle imbued with some piece of divinity? Is DNA a reflection, a kind of mirror where we fleetingly catch glimpses of God? Or is DNA a metaphor, a way to symbolically gesture to a God beyond images or words? Where is God's voice in the created world? To answer these questions, we can revisit my story of the tree of fish. It's tempting to say I discovered 5 new species, not least because it's a pretty cool fact in a get-to-know-you game. I gave them 5 names where before scientists had only described 1. But the fish weren't waiting around for me to announce their identities. If my timescale analysis is correct, The species diverged from each other more than 500,000 years ago. Creatures compete or mate or coexist according to simple biological rules, regardless of our names or definitions. So our phylogenetic trees are not absolute truths, but interpretive stories. We merely lend our categories to a presence that is already there. We can make the same connection to today's gospel. Jesus says, "The Spirit will take what is mine and declare it to you." The Spirit will not create it. She will merely take it, tap into the divine language whose truth transcends our naming or our knowing. And herein lies the real power of today's gospel. God's language doesn't depend in the least on whether we're tuned in to receive it or how we respond. This means that even in our moments of darkness and isolation, in those inner and outer winters, God's voice is not absent. It's there beneath the surface if we only tune in. Tuning in requires nothing more than being exactly who we are. God's language isn't out there, separate or above the language of our world. It's in here, in our bodies, our human experience, our very genes and cells. And second, God is larger and greater than our physical particularity. Like the force of life transcends our species and our phylogenetic trees. But nevertheless, God chooses to speak in a language we can access. He leaves us clues of his voice in the elegant division of chromosomes, in the sequence of nucleotides, in the sinusoidal waves of sound and light and sea, of a pattern and connectedness at the core of creation. And in doing so, God invites us to join the conversation. Some of us tune into God's language through science or music or art, through community or nature or service, or whatever practices you use to step outside of yourself and into a larger story. When we do this, something happens. We feel wonder and mystery and awe, as I did when I stared at the phylogenetic tree. In the face of this feeling, we can't help but respond. We reach out with our own languages, in sermons or symphonies or poems or genetic analyses, to express some small gesture of the presence and pattern we feel. This is exactly what God longs for us to do. By meeting us in the language of what is, the language of the Spirit in today's gospel reading, God invites us into intimate, ongoing conversation and love. This is why I see no conflict between science and my belief in God. It's why after I finish my thesis on the genetics of sea stars, I plan to go to seminary. Both practices represent a constant uncovering of pattern and presence. Both evoke the same feelings of wonder and awe. Both are forms of living out another Mary Oliver poem. Instructions for living a life, she writes. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Amen.